let's start with Ukraine, meaning telling the truth about Zelensky and the fact that these poor Ukrainians are dying like flies in a petri dish. Immigrants, you mean the wonderful non-working folks that Biden's bringing over by the millions who are living in hotel rooms and not working. And you mean refugees? What are you talking about? Everything is backwards, Colonel. Welcome to the program. Let's begin with the real stuff, Colonel. You did a YouTube piece the other day, Is the Ukraine War Lost? Can you give us a short version of that, please?
Well, I think the short version is that Russia has been fighting a defensive war and allowing the Ukrainians to impale themselves on Russian defenses. And they have employed all the modern technology available, from overhead space-based surveillance and every conceivable form of long-range precision strike. And the Ukrainians are now looking at, I think the latest count was an estimated 400,000 dead.
Oh, God.
A satellite picture sent to me recently showed 123,000 freshly dug graves in Ukraine for Ukrainian soldiers.
I posted that and people don't believe me. I said, you know, you can't hide graves with new satellite imagery. And I had an estimate with another gentleman who was on, who I think is a colleague of yours, Larry Johnson, I believe.
Oh, yeah, Larry's very solid.
Larry said 350,000 to me last week.
Yeah.
And now 400,000. And we're seeing estimates of what from the media, Colonel?
Oh, well, I wouldn't worry about anything that comes out of the mainstream media, because only 3 or 4 Ukrainians were accidentally injured in their attack on Russian defenses, and 500,000 Russians are dead as a result. That's absurd.
They twisted their ankles on the way over the barriers to kill those nasty, evil Russians. This is a very serious story. When you have 350 to 400,000 dead Ukrainian men, the country is a very small country at the end of the day. This country can never, ever find the manpower, and I'm using the word manpower, to restore its agricultural and industrial base, can it?
Seems unlikely, because the 14+ million that have left the country, regardless of where they go, have all said the same thing: we will never go back.
Okay, so this was a massive blunder on the part of the West, in plain English.
Oh, absolutely.
And we understand that by provoking this war, for whatever the reasons are inside the heads of these lunatics, they never admit they're wrong, and they only double down, don't they?
Oh, of course, absolutely. In fact, there's an article that just came out in The Atlantic, written by, I think it's Jeff Goldberg and Ann Applebaum, who are 2 card-carrying globalists, neocons, whatever you want to call them. I don't know what you call them anymore other than lunatics. And they are absolutely convinced that Ukraine is going to come through all of this and eventually strike back and retake, quote unquote, Crimea.
Now, wait a minute. These are 2 idiots from New York City, from the Upper East Side, no doubt, who have never slipped on a banana peel and hurt their asses on the pavement. And they're now dictating what's happening in the war.
Well, who knows? I mean, Ann Applebaum married the former foreign minister of Poland. So we can only speculate about the influence of that insanity.
Oh, the interlocking marriage directorates. That's a joke. Boy, it's really becoming nepotism everywhere you turn, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the bottom line for your audience is very straightforward, and that is that, yes, this war is effectively lost. However, every attempt that has been made to negotiate an end to this has been spurned by the West. Washington continues to insist that there can be no negotiated settlement until, obviously, all the Russians have been driven from sacred Ukrainian soil, which, of course, is nonsense. But the problem is, if you're sitting in Moscow and you listen to this, you say, well, obviously, we can't win this war by simply defending what we have. We're going to have to advance. And they have begun advancing up in the northeastern corner of their defense, just south of Kharkov, and they're moving west and a little bit north. It's a slow grind. They're deliberately moving their integrated air defenses and their strike assets forward so that their ground forces are protected. And they're not meeting a great deal of resistance. A lot of Ukrainian forces are melting away. Ukrainians are now surrendering in company-size elements. That's anywhere from 100 to 200 men at a time.
Wait, just giving up because they know they're going to be made into mincemeat?
I think that's part of it. I also think there's a lot of disillusionment with the entire war. There's a growing awareness that they are being essentially consigned to death for no good reason.
Cannon fodder.
And they have lots of people who are wounded. And a Ukrainian officer looks and says, I want to evacuate my wounded. And he's told, no, we can't evacuate it. You're going to have to fight on. And so
Wait, it sounds like Hitler.
Oh, it's worse. It's worse.
Well, wait. Even
the Germans even the Germans attempted to get their wounded out, for God's sakes.
Are you saying the Zelensky regime is prohibiting retreat?
Well, I think they've been trying to stop it at every turn, and they're shooting people, jailing people, imprisoning people, forcing people into the ranks. They've reached all the way to the Carpathian Mountains to force people into the Ukrainian army now. Listen, this war is a catastrophe for Ukraine. The Ukrainian nation has been destroyed. Even if it stopped tomorrow morning, how long would any of this take to recover? I mean, I read a very strange article that was in the British MOD website. And this British military analyst, or at least claims to be a military analyst, says that, well, one of the problems the Ukrainians have faced in southern Ukraine is that the agricultural area, in other words, the fields, have been fallow for 18 months. And with all of this rain, there has been growth in those fields of lots of shrubbery. And the shrubbery makes it harder for the Ukrainians to identify Russian soldiers fighting them. This has held back the Ukrainians. Now stop and consider this absurd statement. This is the sort of nonsense that passes for serious analysis.
No, wait, the shrubs are preventing the Ukrainians from defeating the Russians?
Yes, that's one of the arguments.
It's the weeds that did it?
Yeah, the weeds are growing.
I think it's the weed that they're smoking. I think it's the weed that they're smoking in the United States Defense Department, frankly.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of that up at the top in Kiev too. So look, this thing is over. There's no question about it. And everybody in Washington, I think, is scrambling. They're trying to figure out how do we conceal this catastrophe from the American people as well as from Europe and escape from the disaster that we've created for ourselves.
So aren't there peace talks ongoing somewhere right now? I read recently that there are
not that I'm aware of. I don't know.
I heard that there was some kind of back channel peace discussions, but who would know what's really going on? So the latest provocation that really worried me over the weekend were the drone attacks by Ukraine using NATO-provided Storm Shadow missiles. I think those are Anglo-French creations.
Yes.
And they hit a bridge called the Chonhar Bridge, which links the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine in the southern Kherson region. I said, who the hell is telling? First of all, we were told that the weapons we were sending Zelensky would only be used defensively. That was the first big lie by the U.S. Defense Department. Never aggressively.
Right.
Well, now they're using these advanced Storm Shadow missiles to blow up a major bridge. What do they think Putin is going to do?
Well, we've seen over the last 48 hours what he's going to do. And he essentially launched dozens and dozens of cruise missiles and drones and other forms of precision munitions at a whole range of targets across Ukraine, all the way out to the border with Romania and Poland. So, we know what he's doing, and he's destroying whatever he can find on the ground that supports the Ukrainian war, any equipment that's coming in, any ammunition storage, and now command and control sites. This is a pointless endeavor on the Western side, but here's the bad news. There are a lot of Storm Shadow missiles out there. And even though the Russians, out of say 15 Storm Shadow missiles, shoot down all but 3, the problem is 3 still get through. And when I say we, I'm talking about the United States, France, and Great Britain are still pushing more and more of these cruise missiles. We may have another 100 or 150 of these available that can be given to the Ukrainians. This doesn't change the outcome of any war. This doesn't alter the situation on the battlefield. It will not save the Zelensky regime, but it prolongs the misery. And it makes it increasingly clear to the Russians that they don't have much choice in the matter. They're going to have to march west. And see, they already have in draft legislation that would add another 500,000 mobilized reservists to the Russian forces. The Russians have 750,000 right now in and around Ukraine. In other words, in Russia, in Belarus, and in southern Ukraine. Of that number, at least 300,000 are sitting in a reserve. They have not been employed. They're being held back because of Putin's concern that we may try to intervene in the West on the ground.
Colonel, that's what worries me the most. If I'm trying to put my head into the mind of the fraternity boys in the Biden administration who are orchestrating this insanity, and I look at them and I see fraternity boys who actually look like fraternity boys pretending to be world leaders on the world stage, they're liable to escalate and say, why don't we just go ahead and send American air power in there and get this over with? I'm sure some of them have said that, Colonel.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's been considered, but thus far rejected. I mean, all we can do is hope that we continue to reject that option, because that opens up really all of Western and most of Eastern Europe to Russian attack because of all the airfields, airstrips, airports that can be used. And remember, the Russian caliber missile, it has a huge 1,000-pound warhead on it. It can be conventional, or it can carry a nuclear warhead. Right now, we know the nuclear warheads are in storage. But that caliber cruise missile can be launched from Russia and hit virtually any target in Europe from Norway to Spain. So how do you
now, the Russians have a phenomenal submarine fleet, as do we.
Yeah, their submarine fleet is good, but I would argue ours is better. It's just not large enough. We need more submarines than we have. But the Russian submarine fleet poses a very serious threat. This is the problem with, oh, well, we'll just send in our conventional force to buttress the Ukrainians, Poles, or whoever else is there. Well, how do you get your reinforcements across the ocean? We can only fly a fraction of forces across the ocean. The vast majority of equipment and people have to go how? Overseas. How do you cross the oceans when it's full of Russian submarines? Answer, you don't.
Colonel, this past week, we saw a joint show of force off Alaska with combined forces of Russia and China on the seas. I'm not surprised by this, but Ice Cream Joe has now unified China and Russia, who were actually not allies before this expedition into Ukraine, Russia. Now we've driven China and Russia together. Where do you think this is going, Colonel?
Well, you've got to get Americans to understand that, contrary to their assumptions, we are not always the guys with the white hats that ride in as everybody's liberator. And frankly speaking, for decades now, we have behaved much like the schoolyard bully who goes.
Oh, come on, you can't say that. Now you're Putin's stooge, aren't you?
Yeah, well, okay, then let's all be stooges. But the bottom line is,
well, who's Zelensky's stooge in the media? You know, every time I get that on Twitter or Facebook, you're Putin's stooge. You know what I say to them? Peace is patriotic. Hillary Clinton. She said that during the Iraq War. So I quote, "Peace is patriotic" by Hillary Clinton, and they usually stop.
Yeah, it's a good motto, and it's true. Hell, that's been good for the entire 20th century in most cases, but nobody does it. No, I think the problem is that we have been behaving like a schoolyard bully. Do what we say, or we punch you in the nose.
Look what they did to Serbia. You know, I was the only one in the media over 68 days during the bombing. I was literally bleeding on the air, screaming against this, because I know the Serbian people were our allies in World War II. They rescued our airmen in World War II. They're wonderful people. They're patriotic people. And here we were supporting basically the Muslim mafia from Kosovo in stealing a piece of Serbia that had been a part of Serbia since the 13th century. But I was screaming into the wind. I just found out that you, I think, shared a similar opinion. I saw that.
Well, I did, but I was on active duty at the time, and I didn't have much choice in the matter. I gave my recommendations to the Supreme Commander Europe, General Wes Clark, and I urged that we not, under any circumstances, bomb Serbia. But I don't think it was in his hands, to be frank. That decision was made in Washington, and I think Berger and Gore and Albright and
Sandy Berger, Mr. Socks.
Yeah, all of those people were involved, and they wanted desperately this war with Serbia. They saw it as an opportunity to administer some kind of object lesson that ultimately would be interpreted in Moscow as a warning. These people
I wrote an article. I wrote an article at the time calling the oily tracks run through Kosovo. And it was about an oil pipeline that ran through Kosovo. It was about oil in some ways, I thought. What do you think?
Well, I don't think so. I think it simply had much more to do with the fact that this was another convenient cause that the left in Washington, and I shouldn't say left, it's back to the Uniparty, because you had people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham who were urging that we bomb the Serbs over Kosovo. Anyone who spoke up and urged moderation, and by the way, the German government never gets credit for this, but privately they were willing to put up enormous sums of money in order to build new cities, new towns, new residences for various people to move them around so that they would feel secure in their respective areas in Kosovo. Of course, that meant some form of partition, which both the Serbs at the time and subsequently the Kosovo Albanians were willing to accept some form of partition. We sabotaged that and insisted that, no, we were going to create this new multi-ethnic, multinational state where everyone would be forced to live together, whether they liked it or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to go back and understand that Serbia really was a sort of testing ground for what ultimately has happened in Ukraine. It was a prelude. We didn't see it that way at the time. But if you look at the media, they were screaming at the tops of their lungs about so-called Serb atrocities. And when we looked at these things carefully, we didn't see the evidence for the atrocities on a scale that were argued. And
we're hearing about Russian atrocities right now over and over again, the same big lie.
Yeah, it is. It's a big lie. But, this is the problem. We are dealing with a group of people in power in Washington who are losing power. Let's face it, the United States is in a deplorable condition. We're watching this business of going through de-dollarization and gold-backed in much of the world. It's just beginning. It hasn't reached fruition, but it is beginning. This is a direct challenge to our financial hegemony, which is vitally important to us given our miserable condition in terms of sovereign national debt. Then we have the military problem. We have really gutted the armed forces in so many ways, harmed it in moral terms, harmed its discipline, its fighting power, yet we're spending almost $1 trillion on it. And we openly admit that if we had to fight the Russians or the Chinese or both, that we would lose.
You mean the new military couldn't beat the Russians to death with the high heels that are being issued? Douglas Macgregor and CNN, even CNN, as left-wing as it is, just released their own poll, which states that the majority of Americans oppose OPPOSE, more U.S. aid for Ukraine in their war with Russia. And yet the Pentagon, Congress, Biden, and the media are so removed from the people's will, they won't even quote a CNN poll. So are the people coming to understand this is a lost cause that could lead to World War III?
Oh, I think so. I mean, the same thing is happening today in Poland, where the Polish population, over 50%, have now said, okay, you can continue to supply things to Ukraine, but please, we don't want to become part of the war. And more recently, the various participants in the elections that are coming in the fall in Poland have now taken a position that Poland is more important than Ukraine, that Poland comes before Ukraine. Isn't that an interesting idea? It's called Poland First.
Gee.
Things are definitely happening across Europe as well as here in the United States. But again, who has the money? The donors have the money. Who are the donors? The donors call the tune. People in Washington respond to donors. And then there's this other really extremely dangerous aspect of the whole thing, which is, well, okay, things aren't going so well in Ukraine. We've done the best we can. These Ukrainians couldn't make it happen, but stand by. We have a new dangerous enemy threatening the entire world and civilization as we know it. It's called China.
Oh, yeah.
And so we see 11 ships that are exercising in the Bering Strait, Russian and Chinese ships, and we are alarmed. We don't bother to point out to people that we routinely sail close to China with various naval flotillas, that our subs cruise the waters, that our carrier battle groups cruise nearby. We were just in the Taiwan Strait with some warships. So the attitude in China now is, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you're going to do this to us, we're going to start doing this to you. This is the sort of mindlessness and stupidity that leads to war.